By the time Landon figured out what he had done, Charlotte was already on a flight to Halifax, with their daughter asleep, across her lap, and one carry-on bag that held everything she had decided still belonged to her. She hadn't cried at the airport. She hadn't cried in the car on the way there either. She had strapped Maisie into her car seat, put the radio on low, and driven through the kind of quiet November rain that makes everything outside the windows look like it's dissolving. She had kept both hands on the wheel. She had watched the road. That was Charlotte Beaumont-Reeves. That had always been Charlotte. People who met her at functions, the ones Landon brought her to in the early days before he stopped bringing her, usually assumed she was someone's assistant. She was soft-spoken in rooms where people performed loudness. She asked questions instead of making statements. She wore the kind of clothes that didn't announce themselves. At a dinner in Vancouver 4 years ago, a man named Terence Galt, who ran a private equity firm out of Calgary and had opinions about everything, had looked right past her twice before Landon's business partner leaned over and said, quietly, that Charlotte had restructured the entire debt profile of a mid-size agricultural company by the time she was 29 and turned it profitable within 18 months. Terence had blinked. Then he'd said, "Oh, really?" Charlotte had smiled politely and reached for her wine. She was good at that. She had learned to be. She and Landon had met when she was 26 and working as a junior financial analyst at a firm in Toronto. He was 31, running a small tech startup that was burning through its seed funding faster than it was growing. He was charming in the specific way that some people are charming, not because they're performing it, but because they genuinely believe the world is interested in what they have to say. And sometimes that confidence reads as warmth. He had walked into the office where she worked, had a meeting with her supervisor, and on his way out had stopped at her desk and asked if the coffee in the building was as bad as it smelled. She had said she wouldn't know. She brought her own. He had laughed like she'd said something brilliant. They were married 2 years later. Small ceremony, Landon's family on one side, Charlotte's mother and her Aunt Rosette, and 3 close friends on the other. Her father had passed the year before. She had worn a dress she'd found in a consignment shop in Kensington Market that she'd had altered twice. She had done her own hair. Landon had told everyone the story of the dress for years, the way you repeat a story when you think it flatters you. As though marrying a woman who was sensible about money had been an act of great taste on his part. The first 2 years of their marriage were genuinely good, in the way that first years can be. Before patterns harden, before people stop adjusting to each other and start expecting the other one to adjust. They lived in a small place in the annex. Charlotte was still at the firm. Landon was trying to pivot his company toward a new direction, enterprise software workflow management tools for small and medium businesses. He had the vision for it. He had always had vision. What he didn't have was the financial architecture to support it. Charlotte built it, not formally, not on paper, not at first. But in the evenings after dinner, at the kitchen table with a glass of water and her laptop, she went through his projections line by line. She found where he was overestimating revenue timelines. She found the expenditures that were eating margin without generating return. She restructured his pitch deck, not the slides themselves. She let him handle the story, but the numbers behind the story, the ones that investors actually look at. She stayed up until 1 in the morning more times than she could count, and then got up at 6:30 and went to her own job. Landon would come into the kitchen in the mornings, pour his coffee, and look at whatever she'd left open on the screen, and sometimes he'd say, "You're a genius," and mean it. He meant it then. The company was called Merritt Systems. Within 3 years it had its first significant contract, a property management group out of Edmonton. Within 4 it had 2 more. By the time their daughter Maisie was born, Landon was speaking at industry panels and being quoted in trade publications, and the company had 22 employees and a real office in Liberty Village. Charlotte had gone back to part-time at the firm after Maisie arrived. She was still consulting for Merritt on the side, unpaid, the way you do things for your marriage that don't have a line item. The shift happened gradually, and then it happened all at once. The gradual part was this. As Merritt grew, Landon grew with it in a specific direction. He started spending more time with the people his new status attracted. Investors, advisors, a particular kind of ambitious persons who orbit successful companies, and is very good at making founders feel like they arrived at their success through pure instinct. He started coming home later. He started going to events on weekends. He started talking about Charlotte's consulting work, the way people talk about a hobby, fondly, vaguely, as something that occupied her time. He stopped asking her to look at the numbers. He had hired a CFO by then, a man named Declan, whom Charlotte had met exactly twice and who had impressive credentials and, she thought, a limited understanding of the company's actual risk profile. She said this to Landon once. He had nodded the way people nod when they're not listening. The all-at-once part happened on a Tuesday in October. Landon came home at 7 in the evening, which was early for him by then. He sat down at the kitchen table. Maisie was already asleep. Charlotte had left a plate for him in the oven. He didn't touch it. He said he needed to talk to her about something. She sat down across from him. He said the company was restructuring its shareholder agreement. They were bringing in a Series B investor, a firm out of Montreal, significant capital, the kind of deal that would change everything. He said the investor had conditions. One of them was a cleaner cap table. He said that Charlotte, because she had been informally involved in the early days, had a small equity stake that had never been formally documented, but that the investor's legal team had flagged. Charlotte said, "I know. You gave me 3% back in 2019. We talked about formalizing it." Landon said yes. He said the issue was that formalizing it now complicated the deal structure. He said his lawyer had drawn up a release. He said it was straightforward. Charlotte looked at him for a moment. She said, "You want me to sign away my equity stake?" He said it wasn't really an equity stake, it had never been properly formalized, and the release was just a cleanup document. She said, "Landon, what is the valuation in the Series B?" He was quiet for a second. He said 42 million. 3% of 42 million. Charlotte did the math without moving her face. She said, "And you're asking me to sign a release?" He said it would only be complicated for a few months. That once the round closed they could talk about compensating her in other ways. That this was just how these things worked. That his lawyer had explained it. That the timing was important. Charlotte picked up the document. She read it. She read all of it, including the parts that were written in the particular way that legal language is written when it wants you to skim rather than read. The release was not a cleanup document. The release was a full relinquishment, past, present, and future claim. It included a non-disclosure clause. It included a non-disparagement clause. She set it back down on the table. She said, "I need a few days." Landon said the investor needed it by Friday. This was Tuesday. She said she understood. She called her friend Rochelle Adair the next morning. Rochelle was a family lawyer in Mississauga who had started in corporate and still knew people. Charlotte explained the situation in approximately 4 sentences. Rochelle was quiet for a moment and then said, "Send me the document." Rochelle called back that afternoon. She said, "Charlotte, do not sign this." Charlotte said she knew. Rochelle said there was more. She said she'd run Charlotte's name through a couple of databases the way you do when something feels off. She said that Merritt Systems had filed an updated corporate structure with the province 6 weeks ago. She said Charlotte's name, which had appeared on the original incorporation documents as a minor stakeholder and advisor, had been removed. It had been removed 6 weeks ago. Before Landon had said anything to her, before he had come to her with the release. Charlotte sat with that for a moment. She thanked Rochelle. She said she would call her back tomorrow. She went and got Maisie from daycare. She took her to the park even though it was cold. She sat on a bench and watched her daughter run in a circle for no particular reason, the way small children do, arms out, coat flapping, completely absorbed in the fact of her own movement. Charlotte watched her for a long time. She did not call Landon. She did not sign anything. On Thursday she went to see a lawyer on her own. His name was Patrick Osi-Brabi, a corporate and family law attorney her firm had used years ago who had since gone independent. She brought the release, a folder she had put together the night before, and a USB drive. She sat across from him and explained the situation. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he said, "What's on the drive?" She said, 5 years of email correspondence. Budget models I built for the company between 2018 and 2022. 2 pitch decks. A series of analyst reports I wrote that were presented to investors, under Landon's name, but in my handwriting if you look at the metadata. And the original text message thread from October 2019, where Landon confirmed the 3% in writing. Patrick looked at the drive for a moment. Then he looked at her. He said, "You've had this prepared." She said, "I've had it organized. I started keeping records in 2021. He said, "Why 2021? She said, "Because that's when I noticed the pattern." She didn't explain further. He didn't ask her to. Landon called on Thursday evening. He said the investor was asking about the timeline. He said his lawyer needed confirmation. Charlotte said she was still reviewing it. He said, "Charlotte, it's a formality." She said, "I understand." He said, "I don't know why you're making this into something." She said, "I'm not making it into anything. I said I'm reviewing it." There was a pause. He said, "You're not going to find anything in there that changes what I've explained to you." She said, "Good night, Landon." She hung up. She signed the release on Friday morning. She had Patrick add 2 pages first. A side agreement filed separately that Landon's lawyer hadn't seen coming and didn't have time to fully review before the investor's deadline. A deadline that Landon had, until that morning, believed was entirely his leverage. The side agreement acknowledged the contribution of work product, assigned a fair market value to the intellectual property she had produced during the period of her unpaid advisory work, and included a repayment schedule. It also noted the removal of her name from corporate filings without her knowledge or consent, which Patrick had framed carefully, not as an accusation but as a documented fact. Landon had 36 hours to respond before Patrick filed the documentation separately. He responded in 22. He said the side agreement was unreasonable. Patrick wrote back and explained, in very measured language, that the alternative was a formal challenge to the restructuring on the basis of undisclosed equity and unauthorized alteration of founding documents, which would almost certainly interest the Series B investor and might delay the close by months, possibly longer. Charlotte wasn't copied on the exchange. She didn't need to be. She was at her mother's house in Halifax by then, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and Maisie on her lap, watching her mother's cat move slowly across the floor in the winter light. Her phone rang at 7 in the evening. She let it go to voicemail. The settlement took 11 weeks. Charlotte was not cruel about it and she was not quick to forgive, and she was very precise about what she asked for, which was a different thing than being vindictive. She had done the work. She had documentation of the work. She wanted to be compensated for the work. That was all. She did not ask Landon to feel bad. She did not ask him to understand. She was not interested in a conversation about what had gone wrong between them, because she already knew what had gone wrong, and she thought the cleaner use of her time was to make sure it didn't cost her anything more than it already had. The settlement included a figure that reflected the fair market value of 5 years of unpaid financial consulting. It included an equity buyout at the valuation Landon had wanted to use to cut her out. It included the family home, or rather, her share of it at current market value, paid out. It included child support structured clearly and with no ambiguity. Maisie would spend half her time with each of them. Charlotte had been fair about that too. Landon's Series B closed in February, 6 weeks later than planned. His company was written up in a business magazine that spring. A profile piece, 3 pages, photograph of him, in front of the Liberty Village office. The article mentioned a restructuring in leadership over the previous year. It mentioned new strategic direction. It mentioned the investment. It didn't mention Charlotte. She read the article once, on her phone, on a Wednesday morning while Maisie ate toast across the table from her. Then she put her phone down and asked her daughter if she wanted more juice. Maisie said yes. Charlotte got up and poured it. She had taken a full-time position by then, director of financial strategy at a mid-size firm in Halifax. It was a step down in prestige from where she'd been in Toronto, but she liked it. She liked the scale of it. She liked that her name was on her door, and that people came to her when they needed to understand something complicated and listened when she explained it. She had also, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, started the early work on something of her own. Nothing dramatic, just the groundwork. Market research, a model, a few conversations with people she trusted. She wasn't in a hurry. She had learned that being in a hurry was for people who were afraid they'd miss their moment. She didn't believe in missing moments. She believed in building toward them. Her mother, Gwendolyn, a retired schoolteacher who had very clear opinions about most things and kept them to herself until you asked, said to her one evening in March, after Maisie was in bed, "You seem lighter." Charlotte thought about it. She said, "I think I am." Her mother nodded and looked out at the harbor through the window. It was still cold, but the days were getting longer. You could feel it without quite being able to see it yet. Her mother said, "You were always the one keeping things running. You know that." Charlotte said she knew. Her mother said, "He knew it too. That's why he tried to get you to sign it quickly." Charlotte didn't say anything to that. She picked up her tea. Her mother said, "People do that. Try to get things signed before you have time to read them." Charlotte said, "He almost managed it." Her mother said, almost outside, the water was dark and flat, and the lights of the city were beginning to come on across the harbor, one at a time, steady and quiet, the way things that are going to last a long time tend to do. Landon called in April. It was the first time they had spoken directly since the settlement finalized. Everything before that had been through lawyers, and the co-parenting logistics had been handled over text. Brief and functional, the way Charlotte preferred. He said he wanted to talk. She said, "About Maisie?" He said no. He said about everything else. She said, "Landon." He said he thought she should know that the CFO he'd hired, Declan, had misrepresented his qualifications and the board was dealing with it. He said the projections for Q1 had come in significantly under. She did not say anything. He said, "I know you saw that coming." She said, "I don't remember saying that." He said, "You said something about his understanding of the risk profile." She said, "I mentioned it once." He said, "I know." There was a silence. He said, "I'm not calling to ask you to come back. I wanted you to know that I know." She sat with that for a moment. She thought about what it would have meant to her to hear that 2 years ago. She thought about how much smaller it was now. She said, "Thank you for telling me." He said, "That's it?" She said, "What else would there be?" He didn't have an answer for that. She said to give her a call on Sunday about pickup time for Maisie. She said she hoped the Q2 numbers were better. She said goodbye. She set the phone down on the kitchen table. Outside, her daughter was in the backyard, moving in a circle for no particular reason, arms out, absorbed entirely in the movement. Charlotte watched her through the window for a moment. Then she picked up her pen, turned back to the page in front of her, and kept working.